Okay, good evening. Welcome to Politics and Prose Bookstore. My name is Rich. I'm a bookseller here. We're back to hosting in-person events, and we're still hosting virtual events along with partnered and supported events as well as trips and classes. For a full list of everything, you can go to our website, politics-prose.com. We also have handouts at the front of the store along with the calendar as well. So I'm just going to go over some quick housekeeping before we get started today. If you've not already done so, if you can silence your cell phone or turn it off, that would be great. When we get time to open to the floor to questions, we've got a standing microphone to the right of this pillar here. So please line up in front of the microphone to the right of the pillar and be sure to speak into the microphone. We want your question to be heard. In the recording of the event, we are both audio and video recording today's program, so you can watch it at the Politics and Prose YouTube channel. Following the Q&A, we'll have a sign up here at this table. If you've not already done so, you can purchase the book at the register. Again, we'll ask you to line up to the right of the pillar, and we'll come by and ask for personalizations. Once the event is complete, if we can just ask you to help us out a bit and fold your chair up and just lean it against something sturdy, that would be really great. Okay, so without further ado, we're very excited to be welcoming Laura Meckler. She is a national education writer for the Washington Post, where she covers education across the country, as well as national education policy and politics. She previously reported on the White House, presidential politics, immigration, and healthcare for the Wall Street Journal, as well as health and social policy for the Associated Press. Her honors include a journal on C-SPAN and the Associate Director of the School of Media and Public Affairs at the George Washington University. So please join me in welcoming Laura Meckler and Jessie J. Holland.
Wow, this is quite the turnout. This is great.
This is great, isn't it?
Yes, very much so. I mean, not so great for the people who don't have seats, but really, really great from this point of view.
Succinct and short for them.
We'll keep it engaging. We'll keep it engaging and interesting for them. They'll be light on their feet.
Exactly. So first of all, I have to say thank you to Laura for inviting me to be here with her. I was lucky enough to see an early copy of this book. And if you want to know what I think about it, just look on the back, because my blurb is the last one on it. So thank you so much for allowing me to see an early copy of it and for the work that you've done here. So we're going to have a quick conversation. We'll take a few minutes and we'll talk about the book and the process of writing it, but we'll also ask for your questions. So I'll stop talking after a while and I'll turn it over to y'all, because you probably have better questions than I do. And I've already learned there are several people from Shaker Heights in the audience. and I know y'all have questions for her. But I want to start this conversation off by asking you, Laura, why did you decide to write this book? Why was it a time to explore Dreamtown now?
Well, it's interesting because I was never somebody who particularly wanted to write a book. It wasn't something I aspired to. I was perfectly happy being a newspaper reporter and journalist. In fact, when people talked about exactly what it took to write books, it sounded wholly unappealing. And I thought, it's not for me. But as I was reporting a story, started at the Journal and ultimately ran in the Washington Post about Shaker Heights and its relationship with issues of race, I just started to become just more and more attached to the subject. It's something I've been thinking about my whole life from when growing up there. And it started feeling like, this really could be a book. This is a story that has never been told in a book, although it has been told in many other forms, in documentaries and academic work, lots of journalism in and around Shaker. And I just felt like this was a story that needed to be told. It both sort of has this incredible history that is very unusual about how this community embraced integration over, and very different from how it was founded. It evolved into this integration pioneer, and then it has a very modern story as well about sort of this quest for racial equity today, especially in the schools, and seeing to whether Black kids are getting the same high quality education and same opportunities as white kids there.
So what made you the person to tell this book? What's your connection to Shaker Heights? Why are you the person to tell this story to the rest of the country?
Well, I'm from Shaker Heights. I grew up in Shaker Heights, so that's the first answer. I am not the only journalist from Shaker Heights, though, not by a long shot. But so I was very grounded in the material, and I have been covering education for the last 5 years. So I've also very grounded in sort of the national issues around schools, and the book is heavily, not exclusively, but heavily about education, and it was just something that I really found myself thinking deeply about, and I thought that I had something to say. So other people would probably also do a great job with this wonderful material, but they can write the next book about Shaker.
Explain to us how you landed on the title Dreamtown. What does that mean for you? What does that mean for the story that you're telling?
So the title was initially inspired by a quote in an article written by Cosmopolitan magazine in 1963. This article came about because at the time, Shaker Heights was the wealthiest city in America. And they wrote a story, the headline on the cover of the magazine was The Good Life in Shaker Heights. And it was this description of essentially opulence and the suburban dream. And there's a line that says, "This is the story of an American dream town come true." Mm-hmm. And I thought about that. And then at that same year, in 1963, of course, Dr. King spoke about a different kind of dream. And that's also a dream that Shaker was just in the beginning of at the time, but it's also been trying for many years to make come true. So for me, it was the combination of those two ideas. Could one place be both things at once? Mm-hmm. And I'll just say one more note about the title, which is that for me, it's when I think about it, it's less about this is a dream town, this is a perfect place, everything has come true, go here and all your dreams will be fulfilled. It's not that simple. It never is that simple. But it's to me, the word dream is almost more of a verb. It is a place that is dreaming. It is a place that has these dreams and is constantly working on them. And I'm sure we'll get into that as we go.
Before we get into the substance of the book, which once again, I was lucky enough to read an early copy of it, tell us about your reporting and writing process. How many interviews did you do? How much time did you spend working on this book?
So I had done a lot of work on it already for the article that ran in the Post. The article ran, there are a lot of journalists in the room. It was a 6,000-word article, which is long for a newspaper article, by far the longest one I had ever published. I had interviewed more than 100 people. At that point, I thought, well, I'm halfway there. Well, it turned out I was not quite halfway there. I was a little bit of the way there. I did count them up. I ended up interviewing more than 250 people. Some of them were main characters in the story who I talked to repeatedly, many, many interviews. Some of them were kids sitting in a cafeteria, and I went around the table and heard from 5 people at once. But a lot of different perspectives. It was also heavily documented. There have heavy reliance on documents, especially, well, not just for the early history, for some of the mid-history as well. There's a lot of wonderful resources in the Cleveland area where the parent groups and community associations, the housing office, all of these different institutions those records have all been preserved and available, and were just found many fascinating things in there. I looked at, according to my Evernote program, well over 1,000 documents. So.
Wow. Now, just for the audience's knowledge, I used to teach nonfiction book writing at Goucher College for years. So I've talked to many, many authors, and I always ask them this question for future authors. Tell us about your writing process. When did you find time to write? When's that sweet spot in the day where words just flowed for you?
After my kids went to bed. That's basically what it was for me. I am a night person, so every night at around 9 o'clock, and rather than settling in for another episode of Shark Tank, I was at my computer writing. And it was one of these things, and I think a lot of us have probably had this experience through just regular journalism as well, where I started out with I knew how many words I had to have, and I sort of divided that by the number of chapters, think, okay, can I get to this point? And then there came a point where it was, this is too long. I better start cutting. So it was mostly at night, and of course, weekends and wherever I could find time.
Right.
I took a couple short book leaves, but a lot of it was done on my own time.
Honestly, that's the way it is for most writers. When people ask me when do I write, it's usually between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m.
Yeah.
That's the only quiet time in the house.
Yeah.
Because I'm also a father, so.
Yeah.
When
Luckily, my kids were a little younger, so they went to bed a little before 11. Otherwise, I would have been completely in trouble.
So let's delve into the book. You start out with the founding of Shaker Heights. Tell us a little bit about that story and how it sets up what we saw for the narrative of the book.
Sure. So Shaker Heights was developed by the oddest pair of brothers I have ever read about. Their names were MJ and OP Van Sweringen. They were raised in poverty themselves and went on, but very ambitious, went on to become essentially real estate developers and creating this community that was meant to be as elite as they came, the sort of the best of the best with exacting architectural standards. It was a garden suburb that was modeled over the idea that you were not just living near a park, but in a park. There were expansive lawns in front of the homes. All the houses looked just so. There were rules about what materials you could use, what the garage had to look like, what color scheme you could have. There was no industry. There was just a few little commercial areas, land set aside for schools, for a country club. The idea was that this was going to be for the cream of the crop in the city of Cleveland, and it's an inner ring suburb. It joins the city of Cleveland. At the time, this was the sticks, but they were, as families were moving out, wealthy families were moving out of Cleveland and into this area. That's what was creating. And these brothers were just very odd. They had like an 8-bedroom mansion, but they shared a bedroom with each their own single twin bed. They basically had no social life. They were just basically about work all the time and just never wanted any press, didn't show up to their own events. They're just very odd people, but they had this vision and they saw it through. And it was also, we should say, given the subject of the book, a overtly racist place as well, that you could not, it was meant for white people. Black people could not get in. They were drummed out if they tried to get in early on. There were covenants on the deeds. The covenants did not specifically say who wasn't allowed. You had to get permission from the Van Sweringen Company if you wanted to sell, and they made sure who was allowed in and who was not.
That seems to be an unlikely origin for a town that becomes known for trying to reach racial equality. How did we get from a town for wealthy white elites to the Shaker Heights we're talking about?
Yeah, that's why, and that is in fact why it's so important to understand that history, to appreciate what happened next. So the early black families who moved in were drummed out. They were not able to stay. But then in the mid-1950s, there were a few black families who managed through various ways, various very creative ways, to buy property in, was actually the city of Cleveland, but the Shaker Heights school system, which is a swath of the city of Cleveland that's in the Shaker School District. And the initial reaction was just like it had been 30 years earlier when a black family arrived. An urgent meeting at the elementary school. What are we going to do about the so-called undesirables, as the lovely term that was used? I think they thought they were being clever by not actually saying black people. So it's just undesirables. No, it's just not. We're not against black people. We're just against undesirable people. Anyway, but there's something different happened there. And in fact, I should also say, soon after, one of the houses of one of the black families that was under construction was firebombed and the garage was destroyed. And the response to this, though, was very different than what had happened 30 years earlier. There were white people living there who were horrified by this, who did not want this to be what their community was. They wanted a different path, and they decided to do something that is actually both very ordinary and perhaps somewhat extraordinary, which was to get to know each other. It just started out with block clubs where they would get together for barbecues. And then this evolved into a community association. This neighborhood is known as Ludlow, and there actually are a couple Ludlow kids here, I know at least. And this evolved into a community association that decided to actively work against the forces of systemic racism that were keeping this and all other white neighborhoods white, which, I'm sorry, I misspoke. What they decided to work against, they initially tried to keep it all white, but once black people arrived, then the real estate agents and the banks did everything they could to essentially help that neighborhood flip, block bust them, scare white people into leaving. In the beginning, if you were a black family, you couldn't get a loan to move into a white neighborhood. Once the neighborhood started changing, if you were a white family, you couldn't get a loan to move into that neighborhood. It was a bad investment. It was risky, quote unquote. And this group of families, these pioneers, and both white and black, decided that they were going to fight back against this. They essentially created their own housing service. They recruited, they advertised, they celebrated their wins, they manifested success, I think it's fair to say, before they even had it. And slowly the numbers started to change and white families started moving in. And that eventually ethos just sort of spread to the rest of the city, and it eventually changed the very identity of the city.
Well, I grew up in the South in the 1970s, and the first half of that story sounds very familiar. But the second half is the part where everyone's working together is a bit different from my experience in the South. What was so different about this neighborhood? What made that happen? Who made that happen?
Well, I think it was a combination of that initial group of Ludlow. I think was the most important people. Now keep in mind that this is as the civil rights movement is really gaining force. They saw themselves as kin. There were a lot of Jewish families there who also, there were a lot of Jews who were active in the civil rights movement nationally, and the families who were living there felt that that was part of their calling as well. There was something about also putting aside their sort of moral interest in it, there was also sort of a shared class interest to it as well, in that they didn't want to move, they didn't want to leave, and they saw a kinship with these families. These black families who moved in were incredibly accomplished people. They were had a lot in common as well, and they were able to see that, and that I think was the basis of the work that they did together.
One of the things that impressed me when I read the early copy of the book, and I think I might have actually told you this, is that many of these stories are always told from the white perspective, and people are always interviewing the white families about what happened. You actually talked to some of the black families as well. How did you ensure that their voices were authentic in what you were writing? How do you ensure that their stories are actually being included in this and they're being represented fairly in this story?
Well, that's something, of course, that as journalists, that is our job in general to do, to interview people who are both, that we have things in common with, and also who we have differences with as well. But I was particularly sensitive to the fact that I was a white reporter, white journalist, writing about these issues of race. And so I was very careful to spend a lot of time with, and not just, this was true with white people as well who I talked to, but to make sure that I was representing them the way, especially their family stories, the way that felt accurate and authentic to them. So reviewing with them exactly what I was planning to say, and spending a lot of time. These were not just like one-off interviews for the deep family stories that were told. These were many conversations over a long period of time.
Well, let's move away from the town and talk about the school. So how is all of this affecting the school system in Shaker Heights? What are the parents and the children doing? What are they seeing in the school system as the town is going through all of these changes?
Right. So, integration, the arrival of black families is sort of spreading across other neighborhoods. And in fact, there was one neighborhood in Shaker that did experience rapid white flight. It's called Moreland. And there were, the school became overwhelmingly black, one of 9 elementary schools. And that was just sort of the way it was until the arrival of a superintendent named Jack Lawson, who was a very forward-looking person. And he saw this. Now, this, of course, he arrives in the mid-'60s, so Brown versus Board of Education is a decade old. Now, not that people are necessarily adhering to that order, but it is on the books, and it's part of our national conversation. And he sees what's happening at Moreland and says, well, we really need to do something. And he puts forth a voluntary busing plan. Shaker was never subject to a court order or any, at this point in time, any external pressure, as far as I know, or was able to find. He puts forward a plan, and his plan was to bus the kids who were at Moreland out to and essentially disperse them among the majority white elementary schools. So this was a very forward-looking plan, although one of the themes of this book is that there really are not sort of heroes and villains. These are just like, for the most part, people with good intentions, trying to do the right thing, with blind spots as well, making mistakes even as they're making progress. And in this case, the families in Moreland actually did not want a one-way busing plan, not surprisingly. Sort of the idea, well, we're going to just close your neighborhood school, even though, of course, the white schools were just as segregated as theirs was, if not more so. And they wanted it to go both ways, which Lawson pretty much ignored. But then something, again, that I think is quite extraordinary happened, which was white families living in Shaker decided that it wasn't fair for it to be a one-way busing plan either. And they spoke up and formed a committee for voluntary two-way busing, volunteered to send their own kids to Moreland. And that's ultimately, once that happened, that's when the plan changed.
Right.
And they sort of allied with those, the families living in Moreland, and it became a two-way voluntary busing plan, voluntary in both directions.
Right.
And that really, I think that combined with this housing work that had happened in the decade prior, really started to solidify Shaker's reputation as a place that was really tackling integration.
Right. And this is all great, and it sounds wonderful. But when you look at the schools, what was the problem that you were seeing? There seemed to have been growing a bit of an achievement gap. Talk about that.
Yes, there was and is a profound racial achievement gap in the Shaker schools, as there is in across the country. I mean, this is by no means unique, and that was expressed in many ways, test scores, grades, but one of the most disturbing ways that it was expressed was disproportionate placement in upper level courses. So you had the enriched classes, the honors classes, advanced classes, whatever they were called at the time, top level classes, really dominated by white students, and the regular and lower level classes disproportionately filled with black students. And the district over the years had sort of a split screen response to this. On one hand, they did a lot to try to address some of these things. There were a variety of programs that were instituted over the years. We could probably spend the whole hour talking about all the things that they did. At the same time, they also sort of excused it. You would hear things from them like, well, a lot of the black kids started their education in the city of Cleveland, so they weren't really prepared. But that was sort of an assumption that was made. Just because a kid starts in Cleveland doesn't mean they're not prepared. Maybe some, but not all. By no means, but everybody got sort of painted with that brush. And there were a lot of sort of justifications made, and there were complaints about this level system, as it's called, for years, for decades, these complaints. And I knew that they had been around for a while, but I was surprised how far back they went. I'll just tell like one story. Probably the single most surprising moment I had in this reporting was I was in the basement of the high school looking through some boxes of various types of things, and at the very back of one of the boxes that was about something completely different, I find this academic paper that was written by a graduate of Shaker Heights High School who is now at Harvard, and he wrote this paper for a sociology class, and it was just a wholesale takedown of the level system. He was white, a wholesale takedown of the level system as essentially evolving into something racist, and quoting an assistant principal saying this is our biggest problem. Now, that in of itself is not that surprising. What was surprising is that when this paper was written, it was written in 1969. 1969, which is before the first busing plan, when there was still a minority of black students in the system. It was shocking to me that it went back that far, and also, frankly, very sobering and sad to see.
Well, one example that you point out in the book that really sticks out in my mind is one of the African American students in a history class and finding out that the teacher has to explain to the students what a table of contents is.
Well, so this is Emily Hooper, and she's one of the people I write about. She was in her U.S. history class when the teacher says on the first day, boys and girls, take out your books, and this is the table of contents, and she says out loud, if we've gotten this far without knowing what a table of contents is, we're all in trouble. And the teacher basically sends her to the office. Right. And the counselor says to her, well, your only other option is advanced placement, U.S. history. And
her only other option.
Yeah, that's her only other choice. Right. And her parents didn't even know that was an option. She said, fine, I'll take that. And this is somebody who is an extraordinarily bright person. She ends up going to Yale and graduating with honors. And so, and yet we have what was she doing in the regular history class to start with? I mean, that's the question. And those kinds of stories I just heard over and over again.
So Shaker Heights is getting everything right when it comes to integration of the town. How is it going so wrong now in the schools?
You know, it's a complicated question, and there are a lot of different pieces. Some of it is these factors of implicit bias and systemic racism that course through all of our institutions. And, you know, it's about making assumptions about what kids can do or what they can't do. I'll tell like another story of a girl who I met in she was in honors English class, so 11th grade, and she says that I was listening to her in class. She was so bright. She just had so many wonderful observations and things to say. And afterwards, I sort of followed her out and talked to her and said, you know, did you ever think about taking AP English instead of the honors English? Nothing wrong with honors English. It's terrific. But she was really, I was like, this is a kid who could probably do well in AP. And she said, oh, yeah, I was in that for a day, but I looked around and there really weren't very many black students. And I thought, do I really belong here? And so she went to talk to her counselor, and her counselor said, well, you can go down to honors if you want. And she said, okay, I'll do that. And so that story to me illustrates both the fact that there is this loneliness for a lot of people feel in these classes, and that it discourages people. And then there's also the system itself. Why did that counselor say that to her? Why didn't the counselor say to her, you know what? I think you can do this, and we're going to get you support you need, and we're going to introduce you to another kid who's going to be your buddy in this class, and you're going to do this together. You know, why didn't any of that happen? And this was just a few years ago. We're not going back to the 80s here. You know, so I think some of it is these various pieces of implicit bias that are all over the place. Some of it is economics. The black population in Shaker is a lot less wealthy than the white population, and we know from all sorts of research all over the country that kids who come from families with fewer resources just show up at school with less capacity to do challenging work because, you know, if you're spending the summer, you know, with a summer job rather than at science camp, well, maybe you're not as prepared for science when fall comes around. That's just one small example. You know, if you have parents who have the time and the effort and the chutzpah to go to the school and complain on your behalf and do all sorts of things that privileged parents do, you know, that puts you in a different position than somebody whose parents may be working multiple jobs and figuring what a lot of times what people say is that, you know, it's a great school district, like the school's got it from here. When in fact, you know, I think a lot of us who are parents have realized, you know, you can never do that. You have to be on top of all of these things. So there are multiple reasons. These are complicated questions.
Talk a little bit about the school administration and the teachers and how they were involved in the tension between parents, between integration, between the students. There was one confrontation between a teacher and a student that sort of symbolized all of these problems.
Yeah, so this was a very uncomfortable, upsetting situation that happened in 2018. And this was actually the centerpiece of the article I wrote for the Post. It was an AP English class, an 11th grade English class, and there was a black girl who was in the class, and she had been struggling a little bit early on, came into class this morning, didn't have the assignment.
Right.
The teacher sort of spoke to her kind of harshly about it in a way that other kids could hear, in a way that was very upsetting to this student. And, you know, sort of asking her tough questions. What else are you taking? How did you do last year? Who was your teacher? Questions like that. And this was an exchange that, depending on how you look at it, and many people looked at it very different ways. It was either a teacher trying to help a kid get back on track, or it was a teacher, you know, with this sort of, you know, it's so hard to get black kids to sign up for these AP classes knowing that they'll feel so lonely in those rooms, and here somebody is there and you know, she's made to feel embarrassed and singled out. What ended up happening after that was that the girl's mom, submitted a formal complaint charging that the teacher was guilty of bullying and implying that she was guilty of racial discrimination. It led to The teacher was put on leave. It led to an investigation, a lengthy investigation, and all of this blew up at a big community meeting where, you know, a lot of teachers were feeling like, hey, can I not talk to a student about improving their performance without being called a bully? And then at some point the conversation shifted to parents saying, wait a second, what are we doing here? You know, what are our values? And in fact, near the end of this meeting, the girl herself, her name is Olivia, she just jumped up and got onto the stage herself and outed herself as the person who was in the middle of all of this and asked the question, you know, why haven't we addressed these problems, you know, before now? So it was all it just brought up, you know, like if there's like, you know, some little scabs all over the place, just like took them and ripped them all off and just like very, very painful.
Right. But what was different about all of this when I read this book and other communities I've dealt with, it seemed like people in Shaker Heights were willing to talk about it and not instead just pushing it down and hiding it and then waiting for the volcano explosion.
Shaker Heights is nothing if not willing to talk about these issues. They are very engaged. There's a very engaged community. Talking about race is not taboo by any means. It is something that people engage in. There's a student group called the Student Group on Race Relations that's been around for 40 years now. And this is what they do. They go into classrooms of elementary schools talking to kids about what does it mean, what does discrimination mean, what is racism, what does it mean to be a bystander, what does it mean to be an upstander, having these conversations and getting to know each other, and they also sometimes lead conversations among adults as well as they did in the aftermath of this incident. So yes, this is a community that talks about these things.
With all of the heavy stuff we're talking about here, you end your book with on an optimistic note. Why?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair question. One have asked myself. Some other people have read the book and you know, declared this whole thing is a failure. And I did sometimes wonder as I was reporting this and writing this, like what my ultimate conclusion would be. Is this a story of a place that tried and failed and, well, too bad? Or is it something more hopeful? And the truth is I felt something more hopeful doing this because, you know, we live in a country where most communities are not talking about any of these issues. In fact, in most of America, wealthy people are in school districts with other wealthy people. Poor people, usually students of color, are in school districts with other poor people. And there's no cross-subsidization. Everyone's in their own boats. And is it a surprise when you have a community full of families who are struggling that there's low test scores? I mean, that's not a surprise. That's wholly predictable. It has nothing to do with what kind of teaching is happening inside that building. And so this is a place that is both racially diverse, economically diverse, more than ever. And it is still, everybody's still in the boat. And they're still talking about this, and they haven't figured it out. And, you know, this is not a book that's like, here's your 5-point plan to racial equity, and, you know, just follow this, you know, 30-day juice cleanse, and we'll all be skinny. It doesn't work that way, you know. And these issues may never be fully solved, and in Shaker or anywhere else. But I do think the fact that they are still trying and still committed to it is meaningful. And again, it's not about individual heroes and villains. It's about people of goodwill. And so, you know, is that Pollyannish? I guess maybe some people might think it is. They might look at these same facts and decide that, you know, it hasn't worked. But I'm more hopeful.
What can? Before I ask this question, I'm going to have like 2 more questions, but it's now time for y'all's questions. There's a microphone right here. So if you have a question for Laura, please line up at the microphone here and make sure you tell us your name. And then if you're from Shaker Heights, we want to know that as well. And then ask your question. So if you have questions, the microphone's right here. What can other areas of the country learn from what Shaker Heights has gone through, what Shaker Heights has tried to do, and even what Shaker Heights has failed at?
Right. Well, I think one thing they can learn, and this is a little more academic, but, you know, there's a lot of conversation in this country about what it looks like when schools pursue racial equity. And a lot of this is very, people who are very critical of it, you know, view this as overly woke, who view this as essentially offensive. I think there would be people who would say this is straight up offensive, and that conversation often happens in a very caricatured way. And I think one thing you can learn is, well, okay, this is what it is. This is what it looks like when you try. Now, some people will look at that and say, yeah, I don't want that, and that's what makes the world go round. But they'll at least know what we're talking about here. I think that's number one. Number two is, there are all sorts of communities. This is not the only one that are working on these issues. They're all over the country, places that diverse communities. And there are all sorts of little nuggets in here about different things that people do. And the big nugget, and we don't really know yet whether this is successful or not, this is a chapter near the end, is in 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, they embarked upon what's called detracking, which is combining kids of different abilities in the same classes, basically from 5th through more or less 9th grade. So there's still these advanced placement and international baccalaureate classes offered, but for most of the classes underneath that, kids are being combined, and the hope is to set more kids up for success, teach everybody at a high level, and this idea that basically everything that they had tried, up to then, what hadn't worked. In fact, I had a very unsettling moment. One nice thing about the age we live in is I could watch all the school board meetings online, from the comfort of my house, half a mile from here. And at one point there was a conversation about detracking, and the curriculum director starts off his remarks and says, I was sitting there being interviewed by Laura Meckler from the Washington Post. I'm like, by myself in my office, and he says, and she just looks at me and says, but it's not working. I was like, and she was right. And I was like, well, I didn't tell you to do it in the middle of a pandemic. But anyway, I just said that to myself. He didn't hear me over the computer. But anyway, I think you learned something about that, about what that looks like, both good and bad, about what it looks like when you try that. And that is a strategy that other places are going at as well.
And that's a perfect segue to my final question. One of the hardest things for any writer or author to do is to write about your own town. Now that this is out, can you go back home?
Yes, I was back home last week, the entire week, and we had multiple events that were overflowing with people. I'm not sure it was this overflowing with people. It's, by the way, thank you all so much for coming out. I really appreciate it. But there was a lot of warmth, and like I said, this is a place that's used to being engaged in these questions. I mean, there's definitely, there's some people who don't like everything that I had to say here, no question about it. But there was no bodily injury, so right. no one threw anything at me.
No eggs, no shoes, no anything like that.
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. So I'm going to turn over the conversation to the audience here. Oh, thank you. So once again, if you have a question for Laura, please line up at the microphone here. Of course, as you can see, I have 2 more pages of questions I can go through, but I think it's much more interesting if y'all, especially some of you who are from Shaker Heights, can come up and ask a question. So the one thing I will ask is that you tell us who you are, and then ask your question. Okay? So we'll start right now. Please, sir, your question.
My name is David, and can you talk about relations of Jews and Catholics with communities of color?
I don't know a lot about the relationship between the Catholic community, which is not huge in Shaker Heights, and communities of color. The relationship, there is a substantial Jewish population in Shaker, and there has been some very positive things that have happened, like what I was talking about in the early Ludlow experience. But I don't know that it certainly wasn't exclusively Jewish people by any means. So I'm not sure if you have something specific in mind.
Was there discrimination religious-wise?
Yeah, so the original covenants were meant, and it's often actually said that they were meant to keep out blacks, Jews, and Catholics all in one. They were all the undesirables. However, I think it should be said, at least, I'm not certain about Catholics, but there were Jewish families who did get in early. I mean, they did. I ran into several families people whose families dated back to Shaker, into the teens and 20s. So I think that's, says a lot about how these things were enforced, that even though, yes, it was hard for Jews to get in, it was not impossible, but that's different. When it was much different for Black buyers. So I don't think that they were parallel at all.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I actually have to say I learned a lot about real estate. reading about the early origins of Shaker Heights, and that story it just repeated all over the South and a lot of places in the North as well. Our next question.
Hi, my name is Kate. I'm born and raised in Shaker, graduated from the Shaker school system, so thank you. I'm excited to read the book. I'm curious from your national reporting if you've seen any school districts who have succeeded, who have sort of similar demographics, who are doing the right things and have succeeded where Shaker hasn't.
I mean, I don't know of any place that's like cracked the code, you know. I mean, I know there are other places who are engaged in this work, but, you know, everybody is struggling with similar issues, I think.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Nina. We have family in Shaker. My question is, the Washington Post, that original article, was a huge article, and I'm wondering why. Why did the Washington Post in particular give so much space to a story about Shaker?
Well, let me just say I'm glad you weren't there when that conversation was going on.
I was thrilled I was there, but I'm curious why.
You clearly have never worked with Laura.
I'm not sure the Wall Street Journal would have given me 6,000 words. You know, I'll give a self-serving answer, which is I'd like to say it earned that space, you know, by it being a compelling story. But it was also part of a series. I actually built a series that year around questions of school integration. So this was one of 5 stories that was part of that. So it was sort of a run of coverage that we were doing. I mean, the miracles, they also then ran an excerpt of the book, not at 6,000 words, but like 3,000 something just like 2 weeks ago. I was like, I may be testing the Washington Post's degree of interest in Shaker Heights. But yeah, I can't say why, but I'm just happy that they did.
Well, I'll just add in quickly here, as a journalism professor now, you find that the better stories are written by reporters who care about that issue. And we can tell that she cares about Shaker Heights. So when she pitched it, her editors probably saw her enthusiasm for the story and just bit their tongues and said, go for it.
Yeah. It was probably longer than that, and we negotiated down.
Right.
Hi, I'm Lauren. I'm not from Shaker Heights, but I am a journalism student at the George Washington University. He's my professor.
Excellent.
And my question is, especially with the education part of this, how did you balance the interviews and opinions of students, parents, and teachers, especially if there's bias against one another?
Well, I think that that's part of our job in general as journalists, is to take multiple opinions and that come from different points of view of where we see it and kind of put them all together and in a way. And the biggest place I actually found that balancing act happening was the way the book is organized. I don't know if this is what you're getting at, but the way the book is organized is each chapter is anchored by a different person and who sort of is important at that time in the chronology, who sort of moves the story forward. And I was very conscious of having a diversity of people as those anchors, both a racial diversity, but also men and women and people from different points of view, students, parents, administrators, teachers. So hopefully my hope was that by the time you finished reading the book, you kind of have a sense of the perspectives of multiple times. Maybe not every page giving you every point of view, but that you get a well-rounded sense of where people are coming from. So.
Someone just earned their bonus points. All right, next.
My name is Fred. I'm not from Shaker Heights, but I am from Lorraine. And I'm not from Toni Morrison's depiction, because what you described earlier in your book is Toni Morrison's era. I came 10 years later. So when I saw your title, it reminded me of what I thought about Lorraine at the time, because we had the Ford plant, we had GM, we had steel mills. It was an embarrassment to file for unemployment when I was coming up. And so I've never been to Shaker Heights. I'm going home this weekend for the holidays. I plan on going to Shaker Heights, okay, just to get a feel when I get to the book. I didn't experience a lot of racism at all when I was coming up. I was fortunate. Pampered, no, but just fortunate. And the gentleman that's assisting you tonight, I'm kind of juxtaposing his comments about the South and what happened with your experience at that school. And I'm a firm believer in Ohio being a very hospitable state. Okay, that's the way we are. Okay, and I'm wondering that because it was in the north, the surrounding areas of Shaker Heights played an important role to the integration versus if it was in the south, you didn't have that support system that he alluded to. And so while you were speaking, I was thinking about when I was coming up, I would always hear these riots in Cleveland because of Carl Stokes was being the first mayor at that time. And there was very combustible things going on in the city. So I'm just wondering, or could you address those dynamics that were going on at the time with Shaker Heights? You alluded to the civil rights movement, but that's too vast for me. I wanted to know about Carl Stokes, what was going on in the city at the time with the racial issues, and how it affected the city.
Right. Well, that's a huge question that we probably can't fully answer here, but I'll just give a couple thoughts. I mean, one, at the same time as Shaker was working on this voluntary integration of the schools, voluntary busing plan, the city of Cleveland, right next door, was fighting a court order to desegregate their schools. Suburbs that adjoin Shaker Heights, Warrensville Heights, and East Cleveland, rapid white flight. So there's nothing about Northeast Ohio or the east side of Cleveland or anything like that guarantees that it's going to come out this way. Right. It is that, which is why I think this is such an interesting story to tell in part.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm looking at the line, and I'm hoping we're going to be able to get everyone's questions, but understand that we have a hard stop at 8 p.m. So if you can it's a hard stop at 8 p.m. So if you can keep your questions succinct, and we'll get as many as possible.
Okay, great. Name is George. As you both know, Cleveland is a very divided city, east-west. So somebody had to be here to represent the West. But growing up on the West Side, I was very aware of the racism there, and we were aware that Shaker was, more of a leader on that. And then later at the Plain Dealer, I covered Cleveland schools and the racial problems there. I was just back in Cleveland last week, and I was struck by how far the West has come on race. Do you think that, since you were just back there, that the Shaker Heights still has that kind of leadership, or is the gap narrowed?
In terms of race in particular?
Yeah.
I do think it still does, to be honest. I think that especially as sprawl has taken, a lot of people further out, those communities are, pretty white. I definitely don't put myself up as an expert on the west side of Cleveland because, I'm not allowed to go to the west side.
And I'm not allowed.
Exactly. By the way, George's father was also a very prominent journalist in Cleveland whose work I relied on in this book. So.
Hi, my name is Dwayne. I grew up in the Ludlow neighborhood. My family moved there in the early 60s. I went first grade all the way through, graduated in the 12th grade. And during my junior year, I was one of those only black students in the AP classes who felt that sense of, not having a group of people that I could connect with in there. Yet it did not disturb me in terms of being able to do what I needed to do. But my junior year, I approached the school board about why aren't more black students being encouraged to be aware of these classes and encouraged to be engaged in them. And of course, there were black students who I knew who were probably as bright, if not brighter than I was, but why are you taking those, AP classes? You could be acing everything in another level. And at the same time, there was no one really there that was encouraging students or letting parents know about those things. I ended up spending my last year as a page on Capitol Hill. I had the opportunity to do that. I had gotten most of my, all my necessary things out of the way, AP credits, and I spent my last year here on Capitol Hill. But I always wondered what happened in your book was very helpful. There were some painful parts to it because I felt like my voice was being spoken in there. But I always wondered, what was the key to those black students who were successful in navigating it, the very few, though it may be, in navigating the racial divide there, and I didn't hear much about that in the book. And what was it about them? Now, I know what it was in Ludlow, and there's some other Ludlow people here. We had family units that were a huge part and role models within our community that regardless of what the barriers were, we were going to make it. And I'm a physician in this area now, and I'm a facial plastic and reconstructive surgeon and ear, nose, and throat doctor. First African American to head the largest organization of ENT doctors in the country during COVID. And I have black students from Montgomery County come in my office who are in AP classes and have the same problems going on. Why is that? Okay.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I think that one of the reasons why the people who have succeeded and the black kids who are in those advanced classes is, not a lot of them have very accomplished parents who have very high expectations for education, and that's where their kids are gonna be. And I don't know if that was the case with your parents, but it's certainly the case with a lot of those first wave Ludlow families. The black families who moved in were incredibly accomplished. Doctors and dentists and lawyers, and it was one of the first suburbs that was available to them. And it's like everybody who, with means and aspirations, it seems, flocked there. So it was an incredibly accomplished group of people. So I think that explains why, and that's still true today too. Of course, there's lots of very accomplished black families, and a lot of their kids are in those advanced classes. So it's not about nobody being there. It's just about the numbers are not where they should be. And just because you come from a family with fewer means, does that mean that none of those kids can make it in those classes? Obviously they can, but it takes more work. So
maybe another story to be told.
Always another story to be told. At least 6,000 more words.
I just have to say really quickly, one of the biggest compliments you can give any author is to tell them I heard my voice in that
Absolutely.
story.
Thank you for that.
And second, I have to say, sweet red Raiders hat. All right.
Hey, Laura, Shaker grad. This didn't give it away. Matt Lehman. And I was actually one of those kids who was reverse bused to Moreland, and then the parent of a 20 and a 21 grad from the high school as well. And one of the things, you talked a little bit about the economic disparity. And as someone who grew up there, went through the schools in the 70s and then had kids who went through in the 2000s, obviously, it seemed a lot more disparate than when I was there. And the best indicator we had when my kids were in school was the number of folks who were on free or reduced lunch, and that did tend proportionately towards the black students in the school. Did you have any data from earlier on? Did you see a trend, a change? Because I felt it, but I wasn't sure if you saw that from a data standpoint.
Yes, the data absolutely bears that out. The first year that the census gives data for both race and income to cross together was 1989, and that, make sure I'm speaking. Yes, 1989, and what that showed was at that time the median black income was about 65% of the median white income in Shaker. So there was a disparity, but then by 2020, white income had inched up, black income had fallen, median black income had fallen. It was 35% of white income. And part of that was because wealthy black families had other options and took them, and part of it was because there were parts of Shaker, partly due to the housing crisis, that opened up to lower income people. Housing vouchers started to be accepted. There were some of these properties were foreclosed upon. Out-of-town landlords bought them. They were willing to accept housing vouchers where people hadn't before. So lower income people were arriving. So yes, those economic disparities You're not just imagining it.
Yeah.
They have grown larger, and that in a way is actually, it's a big challenge. But at the same time, it's also like a big opportunity. Like here's a district that's educating both kids who qualify for poverty programs and very, very wealthy kids. And that's not a bad thing.
Thank you for telling the story.
Thank you.
We have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to ask those who are left. We're going to get into our flash session. So ask quick questions, and we'll see if we can get quick answers.
Okay, hi, my name is Trisha. I'm also a proud Shaker Schools grad, so thank you for writing this book. Looking around this room, we do see that the majority turnout here is white, and growing up in Shaker, I noticed that a lot of the community conversations about race, whether that was through the school board or even SCORE, was dominated by white people. So I'm wondering whether you came across that in your research and what you make of it.
It's a huge problem, and I think it's both, and that there's blame to go around for everybody. Part of it's the system itself, in the sense of like, are those spaces places where people feel comfortable? Are the PTOs rooms that people feel welcome when they walk in? If you're a black mom and you walk in, or dad, and all you see is a bunch of white moms who all know each other and are clacking away together, like maybe you don't feel like this is a place for you. But there's also responsibility, and we talked about how, as a rule, I don't like to make these generalizations because it does not apply to everybody, but there are a lot of lower income black people living there who have a lot on their plate. I mean, I told the story of one woman who, when she got to Shaker originally, she had 3 jobs, and she said, I was so out of the loop, I didn't know where the loop was. She didn't know there was a loop. Just too busy just kind of getting through day to day. So they're not engaging. And some of the responsibility is on them to somehow find the way to engage and be part of those conversations. So it goes both ways, I think. But that is definitely something that has frustrated school leaders, because they're out there trying to engage with the current administration, trying to engage with all communities, and it's harder. It's harder with the lower income community in Shaker.
Definitely, thank you.
Next.
Yes. I don't have a question. I just wanted to make a statement, actually. I came here just to have my book signed because I am Beverly Mason's sister. And for those of you who have read the book or even perused the book, Beverly and Ted are a subject of the 3rd chapter. They were one of the first black families to move into Shaker.
The first
right.
Black family to move into Shaker. Beverly coming from a very segregated town in southern West Virginia. Ted coming from a very segregated town in southern Ohio. They met at Western Reserve. So very highly educated people. Ted was a dentist. Beverly had her master's degree in sociology, social work. And the next door neighbor was a Baptist minister who immediately put his house on the market and moved. Beverly and Ted worked very hard, first with the Ludlow Association, and then Beverly with the busing program.
She ran the busing program.
She ran the busing program. And so my family was very proud of what the 2 of them did.
Absolutely.
And thank you for writing the book and for including them in it.
You truly have a remarkable family. I wish I would have had a chance to know your sister.
And this is going to have to be our last question.
Okay. Hi, Laura. I'm Shelley Stokes, and I'm very happy to meet you. Congratulations on the book. And with me is Kathy Day. Both of us grew up in
me
Shaker.
As Kathleen Day. I'm also a Washington Post alumni as well as a Shaker alumni.
Yay!
And I just wanted to say that the 2 of us grew up in Shaker. Our fathers were both civil rights attorneys who fought on multiple cases that went to the Supreme Court to help desegregate schools across, not just in Cleveland, but across the country. But my grandmother was also a domestic worker there for many years. So I wanted to just share those things, and we're really curious as to how many people are here. Kathy, you put the call out.
All right, yeah, we wanted to know, could people from Shaker, we're curious, we keep meeting everybody.
Raise your hands.
Raise your hands.
Wow.
Woo! Shelley and I were thinking, and we do thank you for writing the book, and I know I spoke to you before, and so we were thinking of trying to have a Shaker club.
See what you
All
started?
right, they'll be collecting names. Also, we should
grandmother
say
was a
that
domestic
Shelley's
of a
father
person
was.
that was in my class.
Can I just say that Shelley's father was not just a civil rights attorney, he was Lewis Stokes, who was a very distinguished congressman for many, many years, representing Cleveland and Shaker.
And niece of
And-
Carl.
and-
And niece of Carl.
And Jack G. Day.
Carl Stokes.
And Nika-
yeah.
And Carl Stokes is her uncle, who was the
And
first
then-
African American
and Jack
mayor of
Day,
a major city,
founder of
major
the
American city. This is
ACLU
not just
in
any
Ohio.
family here.
So-
But
this
I
is,
have
and
something
I want
to
to
just
just.
dovetail on what you
But
said.
it
about
has
her
to be
mother
like
being
2
a
seconds.
domestic.
Okay, I want to. Yeah.
I literally, my grandmother, when I was at Shaker, my grandmother was the domestic of a kid that was in my class.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
And
there
no
you
one-
have it.
Same thing happened
Probably
to
a lot
me
of the
too.
people that are
Yeah.
with
I
me
just wanna
don't
end
know
with
that, but
I want to end with a
Thank
quick
you.
story about your dad,
Okay.
which is when I was in high school, he came to speak at the school, and I actually asked him about the disproportionate number of white kids in the advanced classes, and I actually don't remember what his answer was. I don't know that he had an answer anyone more than any of the rest of us did. And then when I was a reporter first for the Associated Press when I got here, lots of AP alums here too, I interviewed him for a story I was doing about healthcare disparities, and I reminded him of this, and he gave me one of the best compliments I ever had. He said, "Well, you were asking hard questions even then." So that's like the
great.
best thing
Thank
you can
for the
say to a
story. I
reporter.
love
He's
it.
he was a
Thank you.
great man.
Congratulations.
Everyone, give a great round of applause for Laura Meckler.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming.